I remember the first time I visited a museum. My sixth grade class took a trip to the National Museum in Lagos, and while I don't remember any specific objects, I recall feeling disengaged. My primary school education had taught me very little about Nigerian craft, art, or history, so the tour guide's explanations didn't really resonate with me. Come to think of it, there was nothing about the internal layout or external landscape at the National Museum that captured my attention or sparked my imagination about Nigeria's history. Despite the lack of arts and culture education at school, I was exposed to African artifacts at home. My parents decorated our living room with sculptures, paintings, and figurines from their travels across the continent. So I had visual references for some of the objects displayed at the National Museum. However, I had no understanding of their cultural significance at the time. It wasn't until I visited the Baltimore Museum of Art at 18 that a light bulb finally came on. I strolled into the African art wing and was truly shocked at the number of African artifacts on display and the staging compared to my memory of the National Museum in Lagos. Until that moment, I had never seen artifacts from all over the African continent placed side by side in a white room, and for some reason, it made me feel small. The artifacts in the room were decontextualized, and their little placards with barely any information stripped away all their cultural value. I felt small because even though I knew it was wrong, I couldn't do anything about it. This experience sparked my curiosity about how these objects were made and how they ended up there. I've been researching and archiving stories about African artifacts, colonial theft, and the ongoing call for restitution ever since. My name is Sumaya Sumade Raji, and you're listening to the Native Nigerian podcast, a platform to document Black origin stories and create global connections between diasporic archives and practices. This podcast is produced by Diasporic Femme Studio. Today, we're diving into two daring art heists at the British Museum, pulled off by our guests, Ile Sartuzi and Chidi Nwaubani. Ile, a Brazilian artist and goldsmith's alum, and Chidi, a British-Nigerian digital product designer, join us to discuss Western museum culture and repatriation. While Ile's work, Sleight of Hand, adopts trickery, Chidi's work at Luti is all about digital rebellion. I wanted to speak to them both because they explore heisting as a form of liberation. Let's get into it. When my producer shared the New York Times article about your project, I first read it and I thought I was dreaming, right? I was like, no, like what inspired you to steal from an institution as mighty and diabolical as the British Museum?
It all started when I went to the British Museum for the first time. This was on the 20th of March last year, 2023. And my first visit, when I first entered the money section, room 68 in the British Museum, I saw this man behind the table showing you coins from the collection and telling stories about them and giving you the coins. You could take them in your hand and everything. And the whole setting for me reminded me of street magicians, like doing the old cups and balls kind of trick, more of like a trickster figure. It also came to me, The Conjurer. It's a painting by Bosch. And the whole setting for me gave me the idea I want to do a magic trick and steal the British Museum. Of course, that on the back of my head, I had already the whole discussion around the disputed collection and all the issues, like the whole discussion around the British Museum. But I would say it was first this setting that they had and the relation to magic. That was something that I was interested in. And when I say magic, it's more magic, like secular magic, more of a trickster kind of thing rather than anything supernatural.
It's more about decolonizing the practice. Are we changing the way that we're displaying the artifacts or object? But then also, how are we describing it? I go to museums and I see how they describe an object, but you haven't really said much about where this comes from and the story that is associated with it.
Even if you just think deeper what is the museum? The museum essentially comes from cabinets of curiosity before the museum was created. With that in mind, with that as a starting point, it kind of makes sense that you go into these spaces and everything's in this cold glass box. There's no level of interactivity between you and the object, whereas for the most part, these were not seen as objects. They were seen as living entities.
It's interesting how displays affect your experience of the museum. For Ile, a coin collection display sparked the inspiration for an art piece that led to him successfully pulling off a heist at the British Museum. For me, I'm transported back to the first time I ever saw a Nigerian artifact up close. I was researching for a school journal at the Harvard Peabody Museum, and as I walked into the observation room, I saw a Benin bronze. It was a surreal experience because I had never seen a Nigerian artifact freed from the vitrine, without artificial lights casting nicely curated shadows, or subtle ground markings telling me where to stand. But before I saw it amongst an assorted collection of other African artifacts, I definitely felt it, the head of the Oba. I stood over it, admiring the details and precision it took to create it. I bent down to look into its exaggerated eyes. I wondered about the different skills of violence those sculpted eyes had witnessed before landing on the plastic cart before me. As I shared this memory, I realized that this is the only time I've ever seen the hollow interior of a Benin bronze, as it was below my eye level, reminiscent of the raised mud altar in the palace where it once lay, with a carved tusk protruding from its head. Immediately, I'm struck with the irony at the fact that I'm not allowed to share photos of that visit to the Harvard Peabody Museum without authorization from the institution, even though this object is a piece of my national history. As Chidi mentioned earlier, cabinets of curiosity paved the way for modern museums and laid the foundation for much of Western museum culture. In the late 15th century, known as the Age of Exploration, Europeans traveled globally and acquired various rare objects through theft or conquest, amassing curios and heirlooms as a centerpiece for dinner parties and a show of their might and wealth. However, with cabinets of curiosity, the focus was on the proclivities of the colonizer or explorer, their interests, and their specific methods of organizing their displays. Similarly, at the Harvard Peabody Museum and many other museums around the world, these institutions create and maintain specific narratives by controlling how the objects in their care are displayed, described, discussed, and interacted with. As the Museum of West African Art, MOA, in Benin City nears completion, I dream often about the looted bronzes finding their way to this new home. I wonder how we can foster community and take back ownership of our culture and material heritage. So right now you were just saying that if you had mentioned it to your professors, that they would have been made accomplices, right? Was that what you were saying?
Yeah, because the first idea, the idea that I had that day, that 20th of March, it was to actually go inside room 68, have a replica of the coin, switch the coins, take the original coin, put it in my pocket, and leave the museum with the coin, and my degree showed the stolen coin. So that was more clearly a crime. And throughout this year, I was discussing with the lawyer about the implications of the act and how to navigate and find the breaches within law to actually perform this work. So until a certain point, it was very clear that this was a crime, and I was trying to mitigate the consequences of that. Because the first meeting that I had with the lawyer, I went to him and told him about the project. And then the first thing he said was like, I don't know if that's a crime. I don't know what the crime that you're committing with this idea that you have. And from that, like the first thing that he had in mind was if you steal without the intent of permanently deprive the owner of that object, that is not considered a crime. Because I think it's section 6 of the 1968 Theft Act. And then we had the precedent of the stealing of the Goya painting from the National Gallery. It's a famous heist that the man who stole it returned 2 years later, the painting, and he was only prosecuted for the frame that he lost. So precedent that, okay, he steal and then return. But then after a while, I was, okay, so show me where it is in the law that could like back me up on this. And then he found out that after the National Gallery heist, they created a new law that kind of changed everything. And then this Section 11 of the Theft Act, which states that if you leave the premises of the museum with the object, then it's considered a crime. So this gave another perspective to the project. And I started to consider not taking out of the premises of the museum, but dislocating the object within the infrastructure of the museum. And with that, I think that this gesture, it's even more interesting than actually stealing and taking out of him the object, because like the first idea, it's super confrontational as like me against the British museums, like a ego thing, whereas the other one, I think it's more of a trickster kind of act, and that's something that I'm interested in. And also like when I put the coin back in the donation box of the museum, all the problems goes back into the infrastructure of the institution. And I think that's interesting. Up until the end, I was not talking to anyone at Goldsmiths because they could be accomplices of a potential crime.
As I got deeper into my conversations with Ile and Chidi, we talked about looting, the definition of a crime, and the power dynamics they confronted while planning and executing their various heists. Who gets to commit a crime and go scot-free? A museum stole from us first. Is it okay to steal back? Ile mentions the Theft Act of 1968, a law which was prompted into existence by the 1961 theft of a priceless work of art from the National Gallery in London, a portrait of the Duke of Wellington by Goya. Francisco Goya, a renowned romantic painter and printmaker, is one of the most important Spanish artists of the late 18th century and early 19th century. Goya's portrait of the Duke of Wellington sold at auction in 1961 for £140,000, which is equivalent to £3,936,285 in 2023, and was obtained for the National Gallery. 19 days after it was put on display, it was stolen and disappeared from public view for 4 years. Now, wow. All this for a portrait of an old white military ruler. The Theft Act of 1968 states, a person is guilty of theft if he dishonestly appropriates property belonging to another with the intention of permanently depriving the other of it. Let's break this down. Basically, this law states that taking something that belongs to another person without permission will only be seen as theft if the thief does not intend to return it at some point. Isn't that wild? Why would intention matter in this situation? And do the arms of the British government apply these rules equitably to everyone who engages in such acts? I'm just thinking about what you mentioned now about the infrastructure of the museum, and also what you said at the end about once you put this coin back in the donation box, it was like you were calling attention back to how the museum is staged and the power structures that are enforcing it as that. But I want to know, what are your thoughts on the British Museum and other museums with this sort of like self-proclaimed responsibility to narrate and preserve human culture and history?
That's a big topic. That's a big debate. I think that it's the problem of the universal museums, right? François talks about this in a recently published book that was just now translated into English, but it was first translated into Portuguese in Brazil, which was funny enough, about decolonizing the museum. Well, her focus is more on the Louvre, which is very similar to the British Museum, but all of those institutions, most of their collection based on Louvre objects from all around the world, mainly the global south. So it's also, these museums are also a foundation of ideas of the nation. So there is the foundation of the nation of England or France is based on this colonialist looting. And this is just taking history, but then you have also the problems of these institutions nowadays and what they are still doing. In the case of the British Museum, which is quite specific, is that they created in 1963, I think, the British Museum Act, which states that they can't really give any object back to their origin. So this ties their hand in a way and secures all these stolen objects within their collection. One thing that was interesting that was pointed out in the process of the work, it's also the working conditions in these institutions, that it's a very material and contemporary problem, that culture industry or art system usually have very precarious working conditions. And how this directly relates to the project is that people that were working on this program that is called hands-on, where they handle objects from the collection, these are all volunteers. It's unpaid labor to show stolen objects, which is quite self-evident. And then the first statement that the British Museum gave about the heist was talking about this and trying to put a moral into the stealing, and that this volunteer-led service was based in trust, which is just absurd.
In Britain, there's a law that they created that says that legally it is against the law for them to return any looted artwork. So imagine I went into your house and stole all of your most precious items and then created a law the next day saying anything that Chidi steals from your house is illegal. So whenever you go to the British Museum, they'll say, oh, legally cannot get this back. We want to. We really want to, but we can't. It's not a sense of morality and things. So I think when we look at these things, quite emotional.
Now, this is the crazy part. Imagine using violence to steal objects of significant cultural heritage and then creating a law to prevent their return. That's precisely what happened with the British Museum Act of 1963, which forbids the British Museum and its trustees from returning looted artifacts except under special circumstances. Interestingly, before the law was passed, the British Museum sold about 100 plaques to provide reparations to the soldiers involved in the pillaging and desecration in the 1897 British punitive expedition in Benin. But don't the countries they pillaged and desecrated deserve reparations too? And what situations count as special circumstances anyway? Institutions like the British Museum and the Louvre categorize themselves as universal museums, meaning that they collect, store, and preserve objects to serve everyone, regardless of the object's origin or museum's location. The objects in their care are stripped of their origin by becoming global objects belonging to the museums that house them, according to their national laws, which codified their theft. The problem with these so-called universal museums is that they believe it is their duty to archive human history. But really, who sent them this work? The truth is, they came up with all this grammar to ensure that looted artifacts would remain in their care, and then wrapped it in all this legal red tape to make the claims for repatriation harder. Museums are the original seat of colonial empires and actualize the white supremacist need to control global narratives. To colonizers, these indigenous cultural artifacts are the spoils of their conquest and victory over the world, and a way to propagate their grand narrative of superiority and dominance. Additionally, we must consider that museums are the foundation of national imagination. The grand narrative imbues citizens of colonizing empires with an arrogance, pride, and unshakable belief in the might of their national authority. Because, of course, look at all the evidence of the greatness of their country's military campaigns and the superiority of their peoples laid out beautifully at these institutions, behind the vitrines and under the spotlights. The citizens of these Western empires understand implicitly that empires are built with capital, and museums are a representation of the capital that serves as the origin of their nations. While Western museums are built on and revolve around capital, we posit that African museums should be centered around community. Our wealth of knowledge is typically shared communally through oral archives, craft apprenticeships, shamanism, and indigenous spirituality. So imagine museums were a space to learn about ourselves and our culture through the stories of our elders. And guess what? It's not just an idea, it's been done before. In the 1960s and 70s, a renaissance era for Black culture worldwide, the federal government of Senegal and Nigeria organized the first two world festivals of Black and African arts, Festman in Dakar in 1966 and Festac in Lagos in 1977. I'm not sure why these world festivals stopped. Looking at Nigeria, I'm assuming our governments got rich out of that on the oil boom of the 80s and couldn't resist the allure of, you guessed it, capital. Our leaders ended up sacrificing the quest for a collective identity, which is a necessary part of reconstruction after colonization, for the pursuit of individual money and power. Regardless, we're still feeling the impact of these festivals today as they created spaces for Black people to gather and construct a collective identity, buoyed and informed by the art, and most importantly, refute Eurocentric views of African art, culture, lifestyles, and spatio-temporal realities.
And in public law and in property law, there may have been a way that they could have sued me, which was, I can't enter into somebody's property and essentially take a picture of something. You had a picture inside your house. Imagine if I took a picture of that and then commercialized it. So that's actually illegal because in property law, items in property are protected. But the museum is a public space, right? So then you have to abide by whatever law is for the terms and conditions of the museum. So I went and I read the terms and conditions, and funny enough, they said, oh, we allow photography and we allow 3D scanning. So when I saw this, I was like, okay, there's something here. So I then started researching into 3D scanning. I found out this technology called LiDAR scanning. It uses the data from the lights that it takes on taking pictures to give you back an exact 3D replica of what it's taken. So with those LiDAR enabled devices, I made scans of the Benin bronze. As you can imagine, because of the way we were dressed, there were some issues with security. But again, there wasn't anything that we were doing that was breaking the law. So we managed to do like the first digital heist.
So in contrast to the violent colonial looting, which was like mainly like a show of power and dominance and like the advancement of white empires, right? Your heist was a very carefully curated protest, and your accomplices were crucial, like you just said, to document and bear witness, either through physically being there or helping you figure out the process, but also to record. But I guess maybe even my biggest question is, how did you plan to handle a foiled plot if you were actually caught with both the real coin and the replica? Like, how are you going to handle that?
From the beginning, I knew that this was a possibility, right? And I was willing to be deported for this project. I didn't want to go to jail necessarily. I think that wouldn't be nice, but I think that the project was good enough for me to be willing to being deported and becoming a persona non grata and like never coming back to the UK was good enough. And then, of course, I did everything that I could to try to be prepared for this occasion. And I was talking to my lawyer, or if this happens, what should I do? Who can I call? Because actually, this lawyer who I was talking to, he's specialized in art. So he wouldn't be like the criminal lawyer that I would be using for my defense. But anyway, I was trying to be as prepared as I could. I knew about all the possible, or I think I know what possible allegations that they could have against me. And I had printed the project, like the kind of like my whole document that I've been working on throughout this year, documenting the whole process as an artwork. So I thought that this could also help in the occasion of if something happens, oh, this is like an art project, I was just doing this. I never had the intention of actually stealing it. Of course, the one thing that I didn't wanted was to be caught, as he said, at the museum with the coin, because then you don't have the time to really explain anything. You just go to the back room and then you fuck. Like that didn't happen. But yeah, I was counting on the legal advice that I had, and also playing with this is an artwork, and also this is just a magic trick. I'm having like these friends, they're just like filming. It's just like that we're playing with. It's not anything serious really. But yeah, luckily I didn't have to do any of that. And then when the first article came out, I was a bit scared. Not scared, but it was not nice what they said. The first statement of the British Museum, and they said that they were gonna alert the police about it and everything. So for a few days, like, okay, yeah, they're going to come after me and let's see what happens. And this is funny because I got to know a lot of things through the media, through the press, because I didn't have any contact with the British Museum. But then when the New York Times article came out, and the tone of the British Museum was very different. And then they basically said that, yeah, there is no crime involved here. I thought, okay, so now it's all good. So probably nothing's going to happen.
But was it really a heist if neither Ile nor Chidi technically stole anything? Despite succeeding at his aims, Chidi was targeted and racially profiled during his heist. Ile, on the other hand, was able to execute his heist and steal from the museum within the limits of the law by returning the object to the museum's donation box. Museum collections were originally built on looting, but not all of their thefts or the objects in their care are documented, so the public doesn't know what they keep in their strongholds. Let's pause for a minute, because this is deep. Do we truly know what is a part of any museum's collection? Whenever I visit a museum and I see those staff-only doors, I'm like, chai, what truths are hidden down those corridors? And we aren't even considering the contents of their off-site storage facilities. With so many objects of significant cultural heritage remaining in museums, it begs the question, what is considered a crime, and who is allowed to commit one? When we ask who can commit a crime, we have to look at real-life situations that reflect these inequities. The former British Museum senior curator, Peter Higgs, abused his position by stealing and damaging unregistered pieces from the museum's storerooms for over a decade. And he didn't stop there. He went on to sell them on eBay at ridiculously cheap rates until an antiquities dealer foiled his plot by reporting him to the museum authorities. Isn't it in the interest of a universal museum to ensure the safekeeping of its artifacts? This scandal involving 1,800 artifacts highlights the hypocrisy of the British Museum and its utter lack of transparency and accountability. How could those thefts go unnoticed for so long? One of the leading arguments against the restitution of looted artifacts is that Africans do not possess the appropriate facilities to house and preserve them. Isn't that ridiculous? Like, even if we want to destroy it, what is their business? It is our right to use our property however we see fit. When the artifacts were violently taken, there was no shortage of places to keep them. We kept them in our palaces and homes, placed them on altars, used them for rituals and festivals, and they adorned our bodies. Repatriation should not be a negotiation. These museums have a record of mishandling and mismanaging our cultural heritage, whilst significantly profiting from it. There were no niceties or cooperative dialogue during the British colonial regime. We do not want to engage in conversations anymore. We want our artifacts back with the appropriate financial reparations. Period. I think that one thing I really appreciated too about that final act of dropping it back into the donation box is like when you think about most like looted artifacts, a lot of them were just items that were part of just like regular domestic life, right? And so this coin that was used for exchange, right? You just put it back in with the rest of whatever else that was in that box, just like emphasizing the fact that, okay, this is just a coin, despite the fact that it has all these other sort of issues and historical things related to it. And I think that's something that we forget a lot about. And it's very important to, one, bring attention back to this topic of restitution, which I think you've done in a very elaborate but important way. And I think the British Museum is going to be sitting on that for a bit. But also, why the siege coin specifically? I know at the beginning you started talking about when you first went to the museum last year and it reminded you about the sort of like magician table, but I wondered if there was also some other significance there that drew you to the coin.
First thing was that I didn't want for my gesture to bring back something to Brazil or to South America or something like that. So I didn't want to do the whole relation gesture in that. But I wanted to mirror the action. And so I was aiming for a British thing in the British Museum, which is very rare because there's not a lot of British things in the British Museum. So that was one of the main factors why I chose that specific coin, because it was the only British coin that they were showing in the handling collection. But yeah, like thinking about what you were saying about money and circulation and how it goes back into the donation box and all that. I think that there's something about the scale of this gesture and the dimension that the gesture is so small, but it inverts this dynamics of power with the museum, like flips the relation between the colonial authority and the colonial subject in a way. You're also saying about the simplicity. It's just like a small gesture, and then this can just trigger a lot of discussion as well. So dimension it's interesting as well. But yeah, I think that being money, being a coin, it's something that it's also very interesting. It raises things about value and capital. Karl Marx was writing the Capital, part of the Capital, inside the British Museum. So it was the reading room that they have. It's also connected to that in a historical way, thinking about value and money. So there's a gap in this that I find very interesting because it's about value of historical objects and thinking about what happens to an object once it gets into the museum and loses its primary function. If the function of money was to be, for the value to be basically the weight in silver, then that would be one price reflected today. And then if you think about the cultural value of that, then it's another thing. And then you can also think about this as the fluctuation of the contemporary art market and how all the prices are they're exorbitant.
So let's talk about why Ile's final act was so important. By mirroring the original act of looting, Ile inverts the relationship between colonial authorities and the colonial subject. Through this simple gesture, he garners attention to the overlap between military expeditions, art, and capital. The coin, an ordinary object for exchange, now becomes a symbol and tool to emphasize the museum's role in upholding colonial legacies and appropriating cultural artifacts. The looting of these treasures was driven not only by a desire for power and control, but also by economic gain. Institutions like the British Museum were crucial in legitimizing the act and assigning value to the objects as cultural capital. So while Africans were forced to help them build their empires, they destroyed ours. While I was in Mexico City earlier this year, I visited the Museo Nacional de Antropología, and it was absolutely stunning. I was particularly struck by how they preserved and documented Mexico's indigenous history, from their architectural styles, highlighted in small, medium, and life-size building fragments, to the stories of their domestic lives and clothing. Their textiles were archived from the thread to the loom, alongside photos of the weavers and replicas of the thatched houses they lived in. These installations were further illustrated through drawings and diagrams, and upon seeing them, I lit up with glee. Their exhibits were very immersive, and I remember walking down into replicas of tombs, carefully reproduced to mimic the originals. As I walked around in awe, tinged with jealousy, I couldn't help but think, damn, the Mexican Empire was great. A few hours later, I left exhausted with so much left to see, and an even deeper fascination and respect Mexican craft and culture. And I imagined the delight a sixth grader from Mexico would feel when visiting. Since the artifacts belong to us, why is there a need to reloot?
I think because they've created this whole bureaucratic process around the artifact, and essentially when it was taken, the British were doing this around the whole globe. They would go into so many different countries and just taking, because they had created a law that said that anything that during a military expedition was legal for them. So now if we bring that into the modern day, obviously today, if you went and did that, it's illegal. But another thing is that you can never really steal the culture. You can never really steal the essence. The essence is still there. And if we can at least take that aura and that essence and relocate it into something else and make something new. And that was part of the whole idea of Lutia. How do we take that essence and bring that into the digital? I think it's more the thing of what that object represents. Right? That object actually represents power, and the power for you to tell your own story. And I think that's essentially what we're trying to get back, is that power of us taking something and telling our own story, not having it in a museum. Because a lot of the times you'll see they've given back, I think even last year, they've given back Benin bronzes and stuff. They do a whole ceremony around it. But when you really think about it, for the average person, for the average Nigerian, what real difference has it made? It's more of a symbolic gesture, right? And really what I think is that because it's the exchange has been this symbolic exchange of the object, but there hasn't been an exchange of power, right? Even when they get the object, because they've taken something for so long, like I always say, this damage has been done. You can give it back now, but the damage done is the repatriation, which is great, but it needs to be reparations as well. There needs to be some part of reparations.
What I'm hearing from what you're saying is Luti has an artistic intent to refute these colonial tutorial practices through its process and making this platform accessible to everyone. But as you were talking, you were saying that it's not just about so they've displaced the object. It's not about taking it back and placing it back in the positions that it was taken from, because it's not doing anything impacting the line, for example. So how do we ensure that this act of relooting includes the original craftspeople? How do we take it back to the people and try to find ways to shift some of that power back? Can we shift that power?
We can definitely, and I think it's more for Luti as an art practice. One of the first ways was that the economy of it needs to be given back. I used the NFT as a way of first transparency, but then secondly, within that transparency, there's a fund that we created as a separate wallet where 20% of all profits that we make goes into this fund, which we're using to give back to artists based in Nigeria. So that's part of that reps that you see. But I think also when it comes to the museum, it's not just the act of just giving back your object. It's start to give back some of the power, with money, and giving back some of the profits that you've made, and start funds based on the continent. But also in terms of allowing people to learn part of those cultural practices that, because of the time that objects are spent outside of their home, hasn't been that level of kind of development in those places.
Initially, I was bothered by the performativity of Luti's heist. I didn't understand why we needed to adopt the tools of colonialism to restore the ownership of looted artifacts. Why is there a need to take back something that already belongs to you? Is the goal of restitution not to dismantle the Western curatorial ideology? After months of deep reflection, I have to admit, I'm still on the fence about Luti's approach. I think digital repatriation limits access to those who are privileged and internet savvy. Many of the communities where the artifacts were looted do not see or hear about these electronic replicas. While the digital archive is important in this age, we must be careful not to romanticize the adversity and lived realities of many people on the African continent. And I think, most importantly, as we embark on this journey of rebuilding our archives, we must continuously ask ourselves and truly acknowledge the audiences we are serving. Sometimes we unintentionally fall into the trap of placating those who have committed atrocities against us. Chidi and Ile explore the tension between legality and by any means necessary revolutionary action, which reminds me of Eric Killmonger's role in Black Panther. Although portrayed as a villain, Killmonger's character embodies the generational struggles, exploitation, and oppression of Black people. In the opening scene, we see him and a team of mercenaries steal a vibranium axe and a Dogon mask. The vibranium, in particular, can be seen as a metaphor for the exploited wealth, natural resources, and looted artifacts of the African continent. And yes, rightfully, he responded with violence. How can someone come to your land, kill your family, and steal your property, but expect you to respond with etiquette? Wild. We can also look at the show Lupin, where a Senegalese immigrant is framed for the theft of a diamond necklace by his wealthy employer and dies in prison, leaving his son, Hassan, behind. Years later, Hassan steals the necklace from the Louvre to clear his father's name. Now, this is a prime example of the nefarious and life-altering journeys of these artifacts, often gifted or bequeathed to museums. Let's be honest, it doesn't add up how these rich white families amass so many African artifacts for their private collections. This is wild on so many levels, as there's no way to trace them unless they are donated to and documented by the receiving party. In the documentary Looting Back History, How This Digital Project Reclaims Stolen Artifacts, Dr. Niboku Ozebo Imariagbe, a historian, was so emotional when she finally saw her great-great-grandfather's bronze head in Museum Rittberg in Zurich. That is over 4,000 kilometers away from its rightful position on her family's altar in Benin City. If anyone had a reason to steal, it will definitely be her. These stories from Killmonger and Hassan to Dr. Niboku all emphasize our intergenerational traumas fueled by racism, colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, and discrimination that continue to manifest in our post-colonial realities. So I'm just even thinking about what you said earlier, that the magic that you're interested in is more like the trickster. And so I'm curious of what the significance of magic and performance is in your work. And also, like, if you pull inspiration from indigenous or like mythological practices.
The reason why I said that is basically to separate one thing from the other. So it's like very different from indigenous or ancestral practices. When I'm thinking about this, there is nothing related to that. I usually don't address coming from Brazil or like things about that in my work. I am more interested in secular magic and the figure of the trickster. And I guess that it came with a lot of different things in my work. First started working with theater, and I think that magic came more in my last exhibition with my gallery in Portugal. It was called Vaudeville. So referring back to this moment where theater and magic and early cinema and animation, they were all together in this kind of variety acts. And I've always been interested in working with technology and animating objects, which is part of my practice as well. I have always been interested in the relation between magic and technology. Overall, I think what this work, the sleight of hand, and my previous work share, it's more a simple gesture that shows the functioning of something. And I think that in a way, the sleight of hand is a gesture that shows the functioning of a system, of a infrastructure of that. And I'm interested in magic. And this is just the beginning or part of it because there's so much to really investigate in that. But I'm interested in how we could use formal qualities of magic in art, in contemporary art. So I'm interested in thinking about misdirection and the sleight of hand, all of that as part of art.
This performance that you're describing, is it inspired by indigenous performance practices? I was just looking at how for example, in traditional Yoruba performances, the spectators are also part of the spectacle because they're involved in the play or whatever's going on. And so as I was watching it, everybody's looking at you wearing the mask and moving around and they're all reacting. Also, they seem like they're part of the performance.
I think not directly, but I think indirectly there is something there, right? There is something about how stale the museum can be. There is a lack of interactivity between the subject and the object. Something inside a glass box that you can't touch. Some masks that we use during festivals, the masquerade that we still have today. We don't go and view the mask or the masquerade inside a glass box. It's something that you actually interact with.
It looked like, because I watched the heist, and it looked like you wanted them to know that you were taking something.
Like we said, there's a lot of trauma attached to these artifacts. And sometimes I find that when there have been many sent back home, and when they come back, it's very much like a glorious event. But something still in my mind is that they come back different. They come back changed. There's somehow relics of that trauma, relics of a remembrance of the past that is quite traumatic. And I wanted for the digital to be something different in terms of when you think about the digital, the story changes. The story starts with this Robin Hood story, this heroic act that changes the narrative in a way. So when we move into the digital now, it's actually something that still has the aura of the physical, but it's something that's quite different. And I think that performative act was something that needed to happen.
What is the significance of the masks and that the specific Ghana Must Go print?
I wanted to represent the going of and taking back, and then also going back home. The Ghana Must Go must be for travel, especially within Nigeria, but outside Nigeria as well. Every time we go home from London, we always pack that Ghana Must go back home with the bags. We would always have that bag. So I wanted something that could connote this space, and we're taking back, we're actually taking them, returning them.
You've probably seen those iconic checked blue, white, and red woven nylon bags carried by travelers at the airport, or more recently, on the runway. They're called Ghana Must Go bags and are the enduring symbol of the 1983 forced deportation of about 2 million undocumented immigrants from Nigeria, most of whom were Ghanaian, a very dark moment in West African history. Ever since, these cheap, sturdy bags have become a symbol of migration, trade, and the resilience of multiple marginalized communities. It took me a while to piece together this story, but it's a constant reminder to cherish the stories of our elders and loved ones while we still can. My father and some of his siblings were born in Mampong in the Ashanti region of Ghana. In 1969, my grandparents were forced to relocate back to Osogbo when the Ghana Aliens Compliance Order Deco was enacted. 3 of his older siblings stayed to complete their high school education before returning to Nigeria. She was 9 years old at the time. This event was one of the triggers for Nigeria's 1983 retaliation. I wish I could ask my grandparents about that time and how their life was in Ghana. It's crazy that Africans cannot migrate and travel freely within the continent without facing complex visa issues, exorbitant travel costs, and xenophobia. The artificial borders drawn by European colonizers have split up so many communities, resulting in tension and an inability to tolerate ethnic diversity. While Europeans enjoy the freedom of movement across their borders, Africans are limited by restrictive immigration policies.
Yeah, because I thought about it. I was like, okay, I do have some photogrammetry app on my phone. I can go to the Met Museum today and scan it. And probably nobody would know, and I'll just go and post whatever. But looking at that, you wanted everyone to notice that something was happening and react to that.
It definitely adds in more layers and more power into the actual story, the digital art. It's something that I wanted to do, to reintroduce the story again as something that is changed, something that's new.
So do you intend to stay digital and continue hosting on Snapchat's platform?
Not necessarily just on the Snapchat platform. One of the highest percentages of Gen Zs on the planet is on the continent. The average age in Nigeria is 19 years old, right? Towards the future, we need to be working within these digital spaces, but also working with the digital and the physical at the same time.
The concept of architecture in the digital world is still evolving, but how do you feel about the metaverse? And how can emerging technology meaningfully interact with these looted artifacts?
I see the metaverse, the future of the metaverse, essentially being a space within a space, a digital realm layered on top of the physical. And I've been reading up a lot of different practices that evolve in our own culture. And I saw that there was a lot of things where you had your physical space, but there was also a spiritual space layered on top of that physical. And I wanted to think about a way in which we use the digital realm as well to be layered on top of our physical, almost like having a trio of spaces. You've got the physical space that we can see and touch, the spiritual space which we can possess, but then there's the digital space as well, which can also be layered on top. And that's what I see as the metaverse. All these different spaces layered in that.
Let me confess, one random weekend, I was inspired to pull off my own heist at the Met using a 3D scanning app on my phone. Despite doing nothing wrong, I was still afraid of getting caught. Hey. Later, I discovered that the Met actually encourages visitors to take photos and scans of their exhibits. But imagine my nervousness as I scanned objects connected to my ancestry. I have to admit, it took a lot of courage for Ile and Chidi to execute these heists. As a tax-paying alien resident in America on a student visa, hoping my employer will sponsor my lottery-based work visa, now at the mercy of the incoming administration, I felt that in my chest. The story is long, but God help us, Sha. So trust me when I say I know why it was important to be so thorough. But even at that, I still wouldn't have done it, documented and shared the evidence with the world.
If we had to design an African museum, how would it look like? What would it be?
There are examples of African museum. I think the Umbari, you can almost juxtapose that to what the modern day museum is. But the thing is, the premise of Bury House was very much, firstly, it was a communal building that was created by the community. Community would and come together to actually create this Umbari house, and it was given to the deity of the land. So it's a very different focus that you have in creating this. I think there's this propensity or the mentality that comes from capitalism, basically, of you having to extract and just hoard. Most of the stuff in the museum we're never going to see ever. It's in the basement. We never see it. I guess it comes from that European mentality of just having to take stuff. If you're creating an Umbari house, it was made to decay. It was made to be a reminder of the fragility of life, that not everything is there to stay. It would spend up to a year to build it, and then it was then left and decay until the god of the land then called them to build another one.
A lot of the things we do traditionally are built that way. And then in terms of the responsibility of maintaining it is a communal responsibility. It's not just about one person's wealth. Oh, this is our house and we shall build together and make sure everything's okay. And also they use natural resources. I remember one day someone asked me, how would you define decolonization? For me, a huge part of decolonization and decarbonization is about taking steps back and learning more about our histories, because we do have some practices that we need to just reimagine now for, our time and the way we live. It's not designing something from scratch. If you even think about like irrigation practices in ancient Egypt, practicing that for generations, like Native Americans knew how to migrate so that they don't overfill like the grass and all those things. A big part of that in every aspect is going back to the beginning, going back to the source and reactivating those archives that carry that knowledge for how to live, because they figured it out, or they figured a lot of things. And we've gone through centuries of being told that the African way isn't good enough, which is not true at all. But we do have a lot of knowledge and technology and value in our culture.
I guess it's just another one of the remnants of colonialism, that we sometimes look down on some of those things that were originally ours. We don't have the Africa first mentality so much. Of these practices that you're talking about now directly in conflict with the essence of capitalism in Bury House versus a museum.
Quick recap. We spoke about the multiple plots by Western museums to keep our looted artifacts away from their origins and why restitution matters. After years of exploitation, it's a miracle that our culture is still thriving. We chatted about how museums resort to bogus laws to avoid returning our cultural treasures. But as the saying goes, every day for the thief, or one day for the owner. As much as I daydream about designing an African museum, I'm certain about the feeling I want to evoke. I envision landscapes with carved walls and sculptures rising from the ground. Moss, lichen, and baby weeds growing through their cracks. I imagine running my fingers over them. I see children squealing and clapping as an elder tells stories under a tree. In the courtyard, I hear birds chirping from the thatch roof, mothers and fathers laughing over a communal pot on a firewood stove, and the aroma permeating every room. The landscape is scattered with reclaimed artifacts, framed thresholds, or simply resting on tables. I dream of varied clusters of houses like the Mbari houses, built by the community. I envision a living, breathing indigenous archive centered on culture, nature, careful maintenance, and communal archival practices. Yeah, I know. I dream a lot. Before I go, I have to ask, what are you willing to risk deportation for? Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and leave us a comment on Instagram or via email. Everything is in the description. You can find us everywhere you get your podcasts. We can't wait to hear your thoughts. Join us in creating this collective archive. This is Sumaya Sumade Raji, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Native Nigerian podcast.